For every dying person she saves, she must take another life. By day, she is a white-clad angel with extraordinary medical skills, saving the dying and helping the injured. But when night falls, she transforms into a bloodthirsty demon, killing people. The IV drips and surgical scalpels become the sharpest weapons in her hands. Her transformation stems from one person, her most revered teacher, Professor Choi. He was the one who gradually pushed her into the abyss. Okay, originally a university student with an intense thirst for medical knowledge, was obsessed with the human brain. She was an orphan with no financial means. She would rather bear a huge debt than give up her education, because her greatest dream was to learn from Professor Choi, a leading brain tumor specialist in South Korea. Through relentless effort, she finally passed the entrance exam as an outstanding student. She was introduced to Professor Choi as she had wished. Upon meeting him, she couldn't wait to share all her knowledge with him. She also earnestly begged him to impart all his knowledge to her without holding anything back, because she had staked her entire life on this. Indeed, he was moved by her persistence and sincerity. For each subsequent surgery, he proactively called her name so she could stand at the front and learn from him up close. He almost poured all his heart into teaching her. Seok did not disappoint him. In less than a year, she was able to perform surgeries independently. She became Professor Choi's most beloved student. Her career path seemed incredibly bright. However, a turning point that plunged her into the abyss appeared. The hospital offered a scholarship for advanced training abroad. In everyone's eyes, this scholarship would undoubtedly go to Seok. She happily prepared everything. But when the list was announced, the spot was given to someone else. Seok immediately became furious and stormed into Professor Choi's office to confront him. The mother of the chosen student was also present. Seok then berated the woman, accusing her of buying a spot for her son and berating her for her low-class behavior. In a fit of anger, Professor Choi slapped Seok hard, suspending all her scheduled surgeries. However, that day, while Professor Choi and the hospital's chief surgeons were attending a meeting, a car accident victim needed brain surgery. Due to the critical situation, Seok had no choice but to take up the scalpel and save the patient. When Professor Choi returned and saw this, he was furious. He ordered her to immediately put down the scalpel and leave. She calmly explained the situation, clearly outlining the surgical plan and stating that she was now responsible for her patient. But he still had someone drag her out. His stubbornness completely devastated her. Then she grabbed an IV drip and lunged at him from behind, strangling him. If no one had intervened, he probably would have suffocated. He became enraged and slapped her hard in the face in front of everyone. This slap sent Seok to the ground, shattering her self-esteem. But it wasn't over yet. Professor Choi revoked Seok's operating license. This shock meant she would never set foot in an operating room again in her life. For someone so passionate about surgery, this was tantamount to taking her own life. So she knelt in the rain, begging for forgiveness. But Professor Choi gave her absolutely no chance. After that day, she completely fell from her peak and became an ordinary person with nothing. She didn't stop after that shock. She became an underground brain tumor surgeon. She performed illegal surgeries, such as operating on gangsters who had committed murder and robbery. Although she didn't have a license, her surgeries never failed. Just after she saved a gangster leader's life, a female nurse secretly added more anesthetic to her IV drip. It turned out this nurse had worked at the same hospital as Seok. She knew everything about what happened between Seok and Professor Choi. Moreover, the nurse knew that Seok didn't have a license, yet she still performed the illegal surgery. What the nurse injected into the IV drip was just sleeping pills. But the nurse used this to threaten Seok, saying she could cause harm to Seok's patients at any time. If Seok performed an illegal surgery and it resulted in death, she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Therefore, the nurse demanded money from Seok, gloating over Seok's predicament. However, the nurse didn't realize she had provoked a very dangerous person. Seok readily agreed to her condition, saying she would leave the money in the storage room that evening. When the nurse saw the thick wad of cash, she excitedly counted it. But suddenly, Seok used the IV tube to strangle her. At this moment, Seok showed no fear on her face, only a look of enjoyment. Clearly, this wasn't the first time she had killed someone. Afterward, she stuffed the wad of money into the donation box, because in her eyes, helping society clean up its messes was considered a virtuous act. Later, Seok's assistant, Young Jo, helped her bury the body of the nurse. He was also a patient she had saved. Because he couldn't afford hospital bills, he always followed her around to help. He was shy and always advised her not to kill people, but every time she killed someone, he helped her deal with the consequences. Besides performing illegal surgeries, she also ran a small legal clinic. Furthermore, she frequently provided free medical care to the elderly. In the eyes of her neighbors, she was both beautiful and kind. No one saw her devilish side. Because of this, she caught the eye of a thug from the restaurant next door. This thug had just been released from prison and was wearing an electronic ankle monitor. A passing police police officer saw him and kindly warned Seok to be careful. Unexpectedly, the thug came to her clinic to harass her, constantly making sarcastic remarks. He even wanted to ask her out to a bar in Seoul. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared at him. This thug wasn't just a lecher, he was also a scoundrel who frequently abused his sister. Moreover, he was becoming increasingly arrogant. That evening, he even chased her to the window of Seok's house. He drank alcohol while staring at her lewdly. This was unbearable for her. In her mind, she began secretly plotting his death. The next day, she proactively went to his sister's small restaurant. She carefully observed him. At this point, the thug still didn't realize he was in danger. She was looking at him with the gaze of death. When Seok left, she deliberately left her umbrella on the table. Then she deliberately waited for the thug at the door. He quickly brought out an umbrella. She also took this opportunity to extend an invitation, much to the thug's delight. The next day, as he was cycling, a red car slowly pulled up beside him. He stopped his bike and was pleasantly surprised to find it was the goddess he had always longed for. The thug then got into Seok's car without any suspicion. He drank the entire bottle of water she had prepared. Next, she bought a large plastic mat and asked him to help her pull it into the house. He tried his best to please her. By then, he was drenched in sweat. She gently removed his shirt and gave him a towel to wipe away the sweat. Finally, he became delirious and fainted. When he woke up, he found himself gagged and tied up. He was terrified, but it was too late to escape. Seok was sitting on top of him, showing her final tenderness. She gently advised him to be obedient so he wouldn't suffer. Then she pulled out a knife. The knife came down cleanly and decisively, severing the artery in his neck. Watching him writhe in pain in a pool of blood before dying, she finally let out a sadistic laugh. She savored the sense of accomplishment from saving a life in the operating room, but she savored the pleasure of killing even more. Immediately afterward, Young-jo quickly cleaned up the bloodstains in the room. Finally, he burned all of the thug's identification papers. Seok dragged the thug's body into the forest and buried it. Their coordination was perfect. Since the thug's disappearance, the neighborhood had returned to its former peace. Seok considered this a good thing. Her heart found solace. Not long after, an uninvited guest arrived. Once again, that person shattered her peaceful life. That person was Professor Choi, the one who had ruined Seok. He seemed to have lost his former arrogance and haughtiness. He even thoughtfully bought her favorite cake. This time, he came to beg her. It turned out, he also had brain cancer, luckily in its early stages. But the tumor was in an extremely complex location, and he knew that only she could perform the surgery. It turned out, he had been secretly monitoring her surgeries all along. He knew that her skills had only improved, not declined. Hearing these words, she found it utterly ridiculous. She hated him so much, she wanted to kill him. Therefore, she couldn't save him. Moreover, he was the one who caused her to lose her medical license and ruined her life. Now he was asking her to perform surgery on him. He didn't offer a single word of apology for what happened years ago. Instead, he used the tone of a teacher, ordering her to perform the surgery. Otherwise, he would report her illegal surgery to the police. This threat was like tearing open a wound. She was furious and yelled at him, telling him he had no right to order her around and to get out. Speechless, he reluctantly left. Just as he reached the door, he suddenly fell ill. He frantically tried to grab his painkillers but accidentally dropped them. He tried to reach for them, but Seok, passing by, kicked the bottle away. The man she had once knelt before in the rain begging for forgiveness now lay pathetically at her feet. This time, she felt no pity whatsoever. She ruthlessly crushed his precious special medication, laughing loudly as she did so. She was trying to release the pent-up resentment she had harbored for over 10 years. This feeling was incredibly exhilarating for her. Young-jo appeared and stopped her. Professor Choi had also fainted from the pain. Fortunately, Young-jo had called an ambulance. Otherwise, he would surely have died right in front of Seok's house today. But she didn't know that she would soon regret her decision. Seok's clinic had been sealed. Angrily, she made a phone call. This time, Professor Choi didn't hide anything. On the contrary, he said that if she wanted the seal lifted, she should come to Busan to find him. She tried to suppress her anger. She wanted to see what he really wanted to do. He was in Busan to attend the most prestigious medical award ceremony. He had been an outstanding doctor for 9 consecutive years. Winning the top award this year was only natural. Clearly, he was the center of attention at the event. But the more famous he became, the more envious and angry Seok felt. While in the restroom, she accidentally overheard a conversation between several doctors. From them, she learned that the sponsor of the award ceremony was Chairman Ichida. Ichida was distraught because her son had a brain tumor. Because the boy was so young, no one dared to perform the surgery. Now, only Professor Choi had the ability to save him. Hearing their conversation, Seok showed excitement because she knew her chance for revenge against Professor Choi had arrived. Soon after, she found Chairman Ichida. They had met before through Professor Choi. Seok got straight to the point. She showed a video of a similar case. It was a surgery she had performed herself. The patient was only 2 years older than Chairman Ichida's son. At that time, many large hospitals had refused to treat the boy, but now he was a healthy person. Seok promised that she could save Chairman Ichida's son. Chairwoman Ichida was captivated by Seok's bold plan and technical skills. She immediately asked what Seok wanted. However, Seok didn't need money. Her only request was that Chairwoman Ichida prevent Professor Choi from receiving the top award this year. She wanted to humiliate Professor Choi. But upon hearing this, Chairwoman Ichida immediately dismissed Seok from the room. The next day, Seok didn't give up and went to see Chairwoman Ichida. Chairwoman Ichida said that someone who didn't even respect her teacher like Seok must have a terrible character. Therefore, Chairwoman Ichida couldn't entrust her son to such a despicable person. Seok thought her plan had surely failed, but unexpectedly, that evening Chairwoman Ichida proactively sought her out. This time, her attitude had completely changed. She agreed to let Seok perform the surgery on her son, but if the surgery failed, Ichida would make Seok pay dearly. Seok still didn't understand what had happened. She packed her bags and boarded Ichida's private plane to fly to Japan. When Seok arrived, the operating room was already prepared. She confidently greeted the critically ill boy. While the surgery was underway, the awards ceremony began. At first, everything was normal, but suddenly, blood splattered on Seok's face, startling her. A doctor asked her to stitch up the wound and take the boy to the intensive care unit. But she didn't care what they said. She only focused on her hands. Everyone panicked. At that moment, Chairman Ichida burst in and saw blood splattered all over the floor. She was furious. If the surgery failed, it meant her son would never wake up again. But Seok remained incredibly calm and completely unconcerned about her surroundings. The scalpel in her hand never stopped moving. She raced against time, second by second, minute by minute. At the same time, the award ceremony had truly changed the winner. Professor Choi was unexpectedly eliminated, and the award was given to a doctor who was no match for him. The entire hall fell silent, seemingly unable to believe this. It was Professor Choi himself who initiated the applause, breaking the awkward atmosphere. At this moment, Seok, who had flown back from Japan, looked at him with a triumphant expression. It turned out that the surgery had been successful after all. Seok had returned precisely to witness Professor Choi's drama. She couldn't wait to brag to him. She expected him to be angry or scold her, but he remained incredibly calm. This disappointed her. At this point, she still didn't know that her successful surgery on Chairman Ichida's son was entirely thanks to Professor Choi's help behind the scenes. It turned out that at the party the day before, Chairman Ichida had told Professor Choi everything. She asked if Seok was a trustworthy doctor. Professor Choi, despite knowing that Seok's circumstances would be detrimental to him, told Ichida to trust her. He said that among all the people he had taught, only she possessed that innate skill. She deserved to be called a genius. Therefore, Ichida should let Seok perform the surgery on her son. This was her only hope. These words dispelled Ichida's doubts. Seok's success further convinced Professor Choi that his surgery was impossible without her. However, trouble quickly arose for her. Her illegal surgeries were exposed. There was an intermediary working between her and the patient. On one hand, he made money, and on the other hand, he sold information to the police to protect himself. The video of her performing surgery on the gangster leader was leaked because of him. The police even took the video to Professor Choi to ask for his help in finding the doctor. He recognized Seok at a glance, but he didn't tell the truth to the police. However, the police still found the location of the illegal surgery. Captain Yang, being a longtime friend of Professor Choi, invited him to the scene to help with the investigation. Although the scene had been thoroughly cleaned, the police dog still discovered a clue on the hill behind. The police dug up the loose soil and found a body wrapped in plastic. It was the nurse's body. Professor Choi seemed to have realized something because he had witnessed Seok's terrifying nature before. Now she appeared at the crime scene, even casually playing with the police dog beside her. The police couldn't help but ask why the dog was so friendly to her. She calmly replied that it was probably because she loved animals. He quickly pulled her aside and scolded her for acting like a madwoman, killing people everywhere. He explained that if she were caught, his surgery wouldn't be possible. She misunderstood, thinking he was taking revenge on her for ruining the award ceremony, which only angered her further. They parted ways on a sour note. However, their encounter was witnessed by the criminal investigation team leader. Captain Yang recognized her as Professor Choi's former student, but he didn't pay much attention. However, the case quickly took a new turn. During the examination, they discovered dog hair on the nurse's clothing. The breed of dog was yet to be identified. The victim didn't own a dog, so the forensic team thought it was definitely left by the killer. But the young police officer was completely unsuspecting. He showed the evidence to Professor Choi. So that evening, Professor Choi arranged to meet the young officer outside. He had already smeared something on the doorknob. While he was there, Professor Choi gave him a handkerchief. At this point, the young officer voiced his suspicions. The woman he had met before was Professor Choi's student. He had just received information that the victim didn't own a dog, so it could be the killer's dog. Coincidentally, Professor Choi's student also owned this type of dog, but the next second, he fainted. At this moment, Professor Choi's true face was finally revealed. In reality, in the shadows, he was a demon even more brutal than Seok. This wasn't Professor Choi's first murder. Previously, he had tried to assassinate a friend he hated during surgery. Unexpectedly, Professor Choi's weakness was spotted by Seok. She didn't want his medical career to be tarnished, so she deliberately injured him when she handed him the knife. Afterward, she used a new scalpel, making the surgery go smoothly. She originally wanted to tell this story, but it only widened the gap between them. Professor Choi was discovered by his most beloved student to have intended to kill someone. It was incredibly humiliating, so he tried everything to get rid of her. His friend also met his demise. After he was discharged from the hospital, Professor Choi used a single knife stroke to sever his carotid artery. Professor Choi acted even more cleanly than Seok. He even thoughtfully offered his friend a tissue, telling him to cover the wound to prevent the blood from splattering. His friend, unable to believe it, ran out of the car and ultimately fell off a cliff to his death. Professor Choi coldly stared at him. Eventually, the body was devoured by stray dogs. When Professor Choi was young, he was just like Seok. He was obsessed with studying the human brain. Seeing a bloodied brain exposed filled him with uncontrollable excitement. So when Professor Choi saw Seok, it was as if he saw his younger self. His desire to drive her away was actually a reflection of his inability to face himself. Soon after, the disappearance of the young police officer caught the attention of Captain Yang. He investigated the police officer's last call and discovered that the caller was Professor Choi. Captain Yang arranged to meet Professor Choi that night to ask if he had met with the police officer. Professor Choi said that they had indeed called to arrange a meeting, but he had an unexpected commitment and they couldn't meet. At this point, Captain Yang's colleague called and said that he had checked nearby surveillance cameras and questioned Professor Choi's housekeeper. He confirmed that Professor Choi had been home the previous night. It turned out that last night, when the butler brought the meal, he heard the sound of running water in the bathroom and mistakenly thought Professor Choi was home. It was all Professor Choi's doing. He had gone out through the back door and driven his luxury car hidden in another garage. He had meticulously planned everything to ensure he would never be in danger. But now, there was another person who could threaten Seok, the treacherous intermediary. Professor Choi tried everything to contact him. He wanted to gauge his attitude first, so he suggested they meet. He said, "I guarantee I won't disappoint you." With such great temptation, the intermediary quickly arrived at the meeting point. Professor Choi suggested that he had a major client who needed a secret surgery and wanted the intermediary to find Seok to be his assistant. The reward was, of course, very generous. Hearing that, he was tempted. When the police called again, he started covering up the truth. Clearly, he temporarily sided with Professor Choi. But to completely clear Seok of suspicion, Professor Choi burned down her dog kennel. Thus, her 3 dogs were also burned to ashes. They were her only source of emotional support in the world. They were like family to her. She didn't know why Professor Choi did this, so she became furious. She immediately called him and arranged to meet him. Not long after, she drove her pickup truck into his car, but she still wasn't satisfied. She reversed and then slammed on the gas again. He slowly got out of his car, stood upright in front of it, and calmly lit a cigarette. Young Joe, sitting beside her, was terrified. He tried to calm her down, but she was completely blinded by hatred. She looked at her enemy and slammed on the gas again, speeding forward. Ultimately, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She was consumed by grief over the loss of her dogs. She felt as if her whole world had vanished. Just then, the middleman approached her and offered a new collaboration. She knew his true nature and didn't want any further involvement with him. Coincidentally, the high-interest loan she took out for university was from him. Now the interest had reached 100 million won. Therefore, whether she went along with it or not wasn't her decision. She didn't know that the doctor she was supposed to collaborate with was Professor Choi. At this point, it was too late to regret it. This was their first collaboration after 4 years apart. They were arranged on a large yacht, sailing in international waters, secretly performing surgery to remove a brain tumor. Because the patient was the highest-ranking leader of a cult, his every action could not be made public. As the boat sailed further and further away, Seok regretfully threw the ashes of the dogs into the sea. She wanted to say goodbye to them this way, but as she was drowning in grief, Professor Choi approached, wanting to talk. She couldn't understand why, if he wasn't short of money, he would perform this kind of surgery. But he mocked her, saying he was different from her. What she pursued wasn't what he wanted. He asserted that he was a scientist, not a human being, so the deaths of those dogs meant nothing to him. His contempt and cold-bloodedness made her unable to control her anger. She grabbed an umbrella and hit him hard in the face. He was struck so hard he couldn't resist. assist. Fortunately, Young Jo arrived in time to stop her. Professor Choi's body was becoming increasingly weak due to illness. His hands trembled more and more violently, but to ensure the surgery went smoothly, he injected his last vial of special medicine into his body. But during the surgery, his hands trembled uncontrollably. Fortunately, it didn't cause any serious consequences. His spirits were no longer what they used to be. Seok realized the problem and proactively suggested switching places, because if they failed, none of them would survive and leave the ship. But a proud man like Professor Choi couldn't possibly admit defeat in front of his student. He endured the pain and continued to hold the scalpel. Strangely, despite his professional demeanor, he initiated conversation with Seok during the surgery. She had never heard such words from him before. She had never received direct recognition from him either. This former teacher was both familiar and strange to her. After their successful surgery, she followed him. He said it had been a long time since he'd felt this happy. He said he didn't hate her, that she was the one who hated him. She hesitated for a long time before finally understanding her own thoughts. She shared happy memories of their surgery together many years ago. That was also the happiest time of his life. At this moment, they opened up like old friends who hadn't seen each other in a long time. For the first time, she bowed deeply to her teacher. In that moment, it seemed as if all the resentments of the past 4 years vanished, but she didn't know that beneath his cold exterior, he actually loved her to the core. Every time he saw news about her, he would unconsciously smile. Moreover, the first time he killed someone was because of her. At that time, Professor Choi's old friend had noticed Seok's exceptional medical talent. He wanted to help her study abroad, intending to use her as a tool to make money. Moreover, most of those who came to his side ended up ruined. For Professor Choi, no one could take away his favorite student, whom he had painstakingly nurtured. Therefore, Professor Choi's refusal to give Seok the scholarship was actually an indirect way of protecting her. He still killed his old friend later because his friend hadn't given up on harassing Seok. He wanted to use his friend's life to protect Seok. Just as they disembarked, the middleman changed his mind. He was about to hand her over to the police, but she sensed something was wrong, so she pretended to have a headache and asked Young Jo to buy her some medicine. While the middleman wasn't paying attention, she escaped his sight. After encountering the police, he discovered she had disappeared. When they met again, he immediately asked where she had been. She said she had just gone out to eat and wanted to talk to him privately. At that moment, she had already conceived the idea of killing him. He was signaling to the police behind them to quickly pursue them. Just then, she received a call from a former colleague. He said that Professor Choi's brain cancer was in its final stages. Without surgery, he wouldn't live more than a month. Before she could react, a familiar figure flashed past her. Then, this person put their arm around the intermediary's shoulder and went into the alley. When she turned around, she saw the intermediary bent over, unable to stand. Professor Choi was pulling him out of there. Seeing the blood on the ground and the two figures disappearing into the darkness, she finally understood everything. It turned out that the teacher she hated the most had been secretly protecting her. He had cleared away all the dangerous obstacles for her. Seeing the police getting closer, Young Jo quickly pulled Seok away. Immediately afterward, she received another message from Professor Choi. He told her to go to a designated location to pick up the car keys. He had prepared the car for her. He had also prepared several different license plates and a large amount of cash. He told her to escape quickly, but at this moment, she no longer cared about her own life or death. She decided to perform surgery on him. She asked her friends to find an operating room. She planned to inform him once everything was ready. Unexpectedly, the death of the middleman caused a huge shock. The way the killer murdered him was too unusual. The killer used a small scalpel to precisely stab the spleen between the ribs, causing internal bleeding in the abdomen. This method neither caused immediate bleeding or attention to the victim, nor did it cause immediate loss of consciousness due to excessive blood loss. This was clearly a work of art in murder, but this also made the police realize that the killer was definitely a medical student with extremely skillful medical techniques. However, the surveillance camera only captured Professor Choi's back, so they could only investigate one person at a time. At this moment, the criminal investigation team leader felt extremely uneasy because he had actually clearly seen Professor Choi, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he proactively arranged a private meeting with Professor Choi. He asked about his suspicions. Team leader Yang wondered why Professor Choi killed him. Was Seok the real culprit behind all the recent murders? Professor Choi chuckled after hearing this and didn't deny it. After returning, team leader Yang reviewed the surveillance video repeatedly. He finally noticed the familiar figure. Team leader Yang believed that this girl was Professor Choi's former student. He also understood something. Not long after, team leader Yang summoned Seok. He praised her talent. At the same time, he admired her because she had a mentor who unconditionally protected her. He asserted that he would definitely bring her to justice. Now he had pieced together the whole story. But but due to lack of evidence, he still had to let her go. Professor Choi quickly learned that County Captain Yang was interested in Seok. That night, he arranged to meet Captain Yang at his secret warehouse. As soon as he entered, he saw a refrigerator locked with iron chains. When he opened it, he was immediately horrified. The person inside was the young police officer he had been searching for, but at this moment, the young police officer was frozen solid. Professor Choi also slowly emerged from the shadows. He not only admitted to killing the intermediary and the young police officer, but also the nurse. Furthermore, he took full responsibility for the illegal surgery. He claimed that working at the hospital was too boring, so he did it to seek more excitement. He completely distanced himself from Seok, wanting to bear all the blame alone. At the same time, Seok found the operating room and informed Professor Choi of the surgery date. However, he didn't show up on the day of the surgery. A friend of his informed her that he wanted to wait a month before the operation, but a month later, his condition would be very difficult to treat. Yet, this was exactly what he wanted. He wanted his condition to worsen before the surgery because he wanted his life to end on the operating table. In fact, before approaching Seok, Professor Choi already knew that this surgery was impossible to succeed. His desire for her to be his lead surgeon was actually a way for him to teach her one last lesson through his death: to accept failure, because she had never failed. That would only drive her to constantly improve. She was his greatest concern in life. Even in his final moments, he still thought about what he could do for her. But now, she was frantically searching for him everywhere. He had cut off all contact and was hiding in a secret place. The police had also issued a warrant for his arrest. The once respected top surgeon had become a wanted criminal on suspicion of murder. Seok didn't know what had happened, but time was running out, so she could only ask the gang leader to help her find Professor Choi. The gang leader mobilized all his connections and found Professor Choi's location, but Seok didn't go there. Instead, she asked the gang leader to go pick up Professor Choi. Meanwhile, she arranged to meet Captain Yang in an empty field. She asked him what had happened. He recounted the entire deal between him and Professor Choi. It turned out that the two had reached an agreement in the warehouse. Professor Choi had investigated and discovered that Captain Yang had embezzled a significant amount of money from murder cases. Seok would not expose Captain Yang's wicked deeds, but on the condition that he let Professor Choi bear all the blame alone. Captain Yang would then let Seok go. Professor Choi said that before he died, he would call Captain Yang to arrest him. Seok immediately threatened that if he dared to harm Professor Choi, she swore she wouldn't let him live in peace. Now Captain Yang was also put in a difficult position. Just as Seok was about to leave, Captain Yang drove his car straight into her. He dragged her out of the car and stomped on her arm. After she dodged, he tried to break her finger. He wanted to prevent her from performing surgery on Professor Choi. Seeing the critical situation, Young-jo immediately jumped out of the car to shield Seok. Captain Yang continued to kick Young-jo violently. Hearing Young-jo's desperate screams, Seok's eyes also turned ferocious. She pulled out her familiar scalpel, then grabbed Captain Yang by the collar. She cleanly killed him with the knife. No one could stand in her way. Afterwards, she called the gang leader. Professor Choi, who was nearby, also heard the call. Through the phone, he learned that she had killed someone again. He was now at the scene. He wrapped the car keys on the ground in a handkerchief and picked them up to erase the evidence. He scolded her for killing so repeatedly. With a sad expression, she asked him to handle everything for her. He told her to wipe her face first and that he would clean up the scene for her. This was the first time she had shown her vulnerability to him. She wanted nothing but for him to live. But he still decided to postpone the surgery for a month. He wanted to teach her everything he knew, but now she didn't want to learn anything anymore. She begged him to live. If he died, her life would be much worse. She wanted him to live to see her become the greatest doctor. She tried to pull him away, but he heartlessly pushed her down. In the end, she couldn't win against him. She had to helplessly respect his wishes. As he prepared to leave, he didn't forget to drive Captain Yang's car away. This was the last time he would help her clean up everything. A month later, Seok's phone rang. They met in the operating room as planned. By then, Professor Choi was very ill. He tried to shake her hand, but she refused. She remained absolutely certain that she wouldn't fail this surgery and that they would shake hands after he recovered. 6 months passed quickly. Seok was still performing illegal surgeries underground, but there was a difference. She was no longer fighting alone because someone had joined her in the underworld. It seemed that she would ultimately be the winner in that surgery. That concludes the film. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye and see you again.